23rd of September 2020. The deliberations will be published on the website of the House of Commons, and the title of the information will always indicate who is speaking and the name of the committee.
I'd like to outline a few rules to follow. Members and witnesses may speak in the official language of their choice. Interpretation services are available for this meeting. You have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English, or French. Les députés qui participent en personne doivent faire comme...
Members participating in person will do as ordinarily, and if we were in a normal pre-pandemic meeting room. As for the various safety protocols, must all be respected, including wearing of a mask.
If you're on video conference, please click on the microphone. Opening remarks. Please go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Chairman. I will provide a short overview of the situation in Belarus, starting from just before August 2020 presidential elections and covering Canadian engagement in the current crisis. I will then be pleased to take your questions. Canada's relations with Belarus before this have been quite modest, yet quite positive, following diplomatic re-engagement and Belarus's removal from the area control list in 2016. That removal lifted all measures in place on Belarus since 2006 because of improvements in the conduct of the 2015 presidential elections, release of political prisoners, and Belarus's facilitation of negotiations on Ukraine. Prior to the presidential elections of August 9th, large-scale opposition rallies had already begun to take place. Demonstrators protested election campaign restrictions that would prevent the holding of free and fair democratic elections. In the lead up to the election, Canada engaged Belarus directly and multilaterally at the OSCE to register our concern with the deteriorating situation and to urge the government to uphold its international human rights obligations. Widespread electoral irregularities were immediately reported following the election. The opposition, non-government organizations, and other governments, including those of Canada, the UK, and the US, as well as the EU, announced that they would not accept the results and characterized the elections as fraudulent. Despite the peaceful nature of the protests that erupted, security forces cracked down brutally and arbitrarily arrested protesters in an attempt to stop peaceful assemblies. Reports emerged of torture and other forms of ill treatment of detainees, including sexual and gender-based violence. The UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Belarus has indicated that to date, at least 20,000 individuals have been detained, with some still remaining in detention. Journalists have also been targeted, detained, beaten, or had their accreditation revoked. Authorities have also stepped up detentions and prosecutions of prominent members of the Opposition Coordination Council, which has a 7-member leadership with Svetlana Tianuskaya as head. To date, all but one member of the leadership are in exile or detained in Belarus. Alexander Lukashenko continues to attack the opposition, accuse the West of interference, and rejects calls for a rerun of the presidential elections. Workers from state-run factories, private businesses, and students have begun to strike after Lukashenko ignored Ms. Tianuskaya's ultimatum deadline of October 25th for him to resign. On October 29th, Lukashenko reshuffled personnel in top security posts, including the Minister of Interior, and designated others as presidential aides in regions with high levels of protest and opposition activities. Canada has been strongly engaged in response to events in Belarus since the beginning of the crisis. Canada is a long-standing advocate for human rights, and we have sent a firm message to the government of Belarus that its actions are unacceptable. Our response has been in close coordination with like-minded partners, which include the EU, the UK, and the US. Together, we have declared that Lukashenko lacks legitimacy to lead Belarus and combined our efforts to support the democratic aspirations of the Belarusian people. Canada has issued 10 statements to date, including through Media Freedom Coalition Executive Group, which is Canadian and UK-led, as well as participated in a Canada-led joint statement on internal shutdowns in cooperation with 30 partner countries. Canada continues to engage our partners in steps aimed at finding a peaceful resolution to the political impasse in Belarus. Minister Champagne has coordinated with his counterparts, had calls with Ms. Tianeskaya, as well as spoken with Belarusian Foreign Minister Mackay. Canada continues to advocate for mediation through the OSCE to be led by current and incoming chairs Albania and Sweden. Also at the OSCE, Canada pressed to invoke the Moscow mechanism with 16 other states, which established a fact-finding mission on human rights allegations in Belarus. The resulting report and recommendations are now public. Minister Champagne's recent visit to Lithuania on October 16th reinforced common support with the Baltic foreign ministers for the people of Belarus. Together, the ministers committed to working with international partners to ensure that those responsible for the violence and undermining of democracy in Belarus are held accountable. Minister Champagne also met with Ms. Tianeskaya in person during the visit to Lithuania. On September 23rd, Canada announced $600,000 in funding to support civil society in Belarus with a focus on helping independent media and women. Our officials are in discussion with potential programming partners on how Canada's assistance can best support democratic governance and democratic actors. Canada and the UK on September 29th were the first countries to sanction Alexander Lukashenko, following his holding of a secret inauguration for himself. Altogether, Canada has sanctioned 42 Belarusian officials under the Special Economic Measures Act for gross and systematic human rights violations. These actions have been taken in close coordination with the EU, the UK, and the US.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. You might be aware, but the phone lines are not working for the staff.
Oh.
Ms. Soda, thanks very much for raising that. We'll pass that over to the clerk and IT team. I'm not sure if there's a reason to suspend or if we should simply continue and that'll be fixed imminently.
You could probably continue. It's just that Parleview has a delay, so as soon as you can get that up and running, it would be great. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Ms. Soda and Madam Clerk. Back to you, Mr. Sproul, please.
The imposition of sanctions demonstrates Canada's strong commitment to human rights and democracy in Belarus and to the dignity of its people. This coordinated action with our partners reinforces our assertion that violence and those acts which undermine democracy will not be tolerated by the international community. Belarus, in retaliation, has announced that it would impose sanctions against the EU, UK, and Canadian officials, but has not to date revealed any details. In conclusion, Canada will continue monitoring developments in Belarus and engaging constructively with its partners to find a peaceful resolution in the country. Canada stands in solidarity with the people of Belarus and will continue our diplomatic efforts to bring about positive change. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Sproul. It's good to have you back with us, and welcome. Ms. Grant, welcome to you as well. My understanding is that you'll make your points in response to members' questions. If you'd like to make a comment now, be happy to give you the floor. Otherwise, at your discretion, just do it in response to the next round of questions.
Thank you. Yes, I will be able to take questions along with Mr. Sproul, but have no prepared statement. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Our first questioner is Mr. Chung. Mr. Chung, the floor is yours for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your opening remarks. My first question is about Ms. Tianeskaya. I understand that, as you mentioned in your remarks and as was publicly reported, that Foreign Affairs Minister Champagne met with her in Lithuania. And I want to know what the government of Canada sees as her role going forward, and what status they are going to accord her.
Ms. Tayanouskaya has been an active leader in terms of the civil society opposition to the government's holding of the elections in such a fraudulent way. She is, her husband, as you may know, was detained before the elections, and she stood in his place. She works very closely with the Coordination Committee, a group of leaders from various sectors of society, to mount a concerted and coordinated opposition to the actions of the government in surrounding the elections and their repression since the elections.
Do you accord her any formal status in the current situation, or simply recognize her as a candidate in the previous election?
We recognize that she has been accepted by Belarusian civil society and many leading members of the opposition for her leadership role. She has been very effective in terms of reaching out to the diaspora in various countries. She has been a leader on the ground, and she has undertaken liaison with like-minded country leaders that we work with carefully.
Thank you. Mr. Sproul, you mentioned in your opening statement that the decision to re-engage diplomatically was producing positive results. Do you still hold that position in light of the events of the last 2-3 months?
During the 2015 elections, we saw a number of positive events which led to the lifting of the area control list sanctions. Indeed, there was a release of political prisoners. There was less repression in terms of the holding of elections. There was enhanced freedom of the press and reporters. And in addition, Belarus hosted the Minsk process vis-a-vis Ukraine. So those positive developments led us to that lifting. However, since, sir, you're quite right, since that time, Chairman, we have seen a regression, particularly in the lead up and the holding of these elections, which have forced Canada to reimpose sanctions pursuant to our legislation.
Well, thank you for that answer. When the government listed sanctions in 2016, it mentioned in its statement that it did so in coordination or following similar actions by the United States and our European allies. What actions did they take at the time that were commensurate to the lifting of sanctions?
They lifted some of their restrictions in terms of travel, in terms of the designation of economic measures against particular individuals. Not all. In the case of the United States, some were left on. But for the most part, our actions coincided very closely with like-minded partners.
Okay, thank you. To your knowledge, did the United States lift sanctions back in 2016 too, or was it simply a lifting of travel restrictions?
They lifted some, but as I indicated, some of their sanctions were not lifted. For example, my understanding is that Mr. Lukashenko remained on their list, as did his son and some officials.
Okay, thank you. What threats to Ms. Tayanouskaya do you think there are with her being in Lithuania? What threats to her personal safety are there?
Well, indeed, she did flee to Lithuania as a result of feeling insecure and the threats that were posed against her when she was in Belarus. There is concern about that, and I am aware that government officials there are assisting in terms of the providing of security. I do know care is being taken, and her situation is being monitored carefully with that concern in mind.
Can I ask you one last quick question, which is why did the government use sanctions under the Special Economic Measures Act rather than the Justice for Victims of Corrupt Foreign Officials Act when it announced sanctions in the last couple of months?
It did so because we saw that the criteria for using CEMA was met exactly. In other words, there were gross and systematic violations of human rights by the Lukashenko regime, together with his officials and those who implemented those repressive measures.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chung. Perfectly timed. Thank you, Mr. Sproul. The next round goes to Dr. Fry, again for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much for that excellent briefing. I just wanted to follow up. I know that at a period in which we lifted sanctions, did we only have 16 other OSCE nations that were agreeing to lift sanctions? Or did we have more join after that?
Lift sanctions in 2016?
Yes.
Those were the key countries which had imposed sanctions
yes.
In 2006 for the most part.
Yes. Okay. As you well know, I mean, given even the Helsinki agreement, all of it is being violated. And I wonder what OSCE, because Canada is actually a part of the OSCE, what the OSCE is planning to do with the fact that ODIHR, which as you well know, monitors elections in the region, was not allowed to monitor elections. Way back last year, they had made 32 recommendations for allowing for free and fair elections, for torture of political prisoners, allowing other members of other parties to be able to run their candidacy without any discrimination and without any fear. None of that has happened, and ODIHR was denied. What are the steps that you think that OSCE as a whole, which I know works on consensus and therefore can get zero done in any instance? I'm sorry, I'm being cynical here. So the bottom line is that is there something that the OSCE as a body can do? Because Belarus is a member, Belarus has agreed to all of the agreements, and yet is not obeying any of them. And so what do you really think that OSCE can do other than economic sanctions and border restrictions, etc.? Because there's rape, there's torture, there's sexual violence going on, there is, complete intimidation. And I think what I wanted to point out, which I think the committee should know, is that the people heading up most of these protests in the streets day after day after day are mostly women. And yet women are being intimidated by threats of rape and threats of sexual violence. What can the OSCE as a body do? I mean, otherwise, the OSCE is really toothless in doing anything.
So far, the OSCE has done two things mainly. One is to offer mediation services through its co-chairs. Those co-chairs are currently Albania, and the next co-chair will be Sweden.
Yes.
Unfortunately, and maybe predictably, the Lukashenko regime has rejected that offer. But they have also appointed a rapporteur to undertake a study of the situation there. He has not been able to travel to Belarus, but he has produced a report. Yesterday he did, with many recommendations insofar as what should be done. Among those, there are several that Canada has already adopted. For example, not to recognize the election, to call it fraudulent, to call for new elections. And he has suggested other measures that member states of the OSCE should undertake, and we are currently studying those.
One of the measures that was suggested was also to release political prisoners, and also to stop the intimidation and arrest of journalists. What if anything has Lukashenko done to respond to both of those, which are very clear questions and decisions that are being put by OSCE. What has Lukashenko said he would do? I mean, to just say no, what do you do to a country that just says no? Can you kick it? Can you kick it out of the OSCE? I don't know. My questions are those.
The OSCE does not have enforcement mechanisms per se. It relies on the actions of its member states. And member states do the sorts of things that Canada has been doing, imposing sanctions, economic pressures, public announcements, work in conjunction with others to bring attention to the situation, reminding Belarus of its international human rights obligations.
And I was just going to get to that, the whole human rights violations that are going on right now in Belarus. Are there any OSCE nations currently at this point who are not joining in the sanctions and the recommendations that have been made by OSCE and ODIHR? What are the countries other than Russia that is supporting Belarus and that is not joining with the sanctions?
There are a number of countries which have not joined with the sanctions. The main countries and institutions which have are the EU, the United States, the UK, Norway, and one more. The others have not got to there yet. We are hopeful that they will follow the lead that Canada and others have and follow in our footsteps in terms of developing those sanctions. We believe they are effective. They send a strong political message, and they have a real impact on individuals who have undertaken these violations.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fry. Mr. Sproul, just before we give the floor to Monsieur Bergeron, I wanted to just canvass your views, colleagues. We are advised that we're still having trouble connecting our staff colleagues to the live feed of this committee proceeding. I'm in your hands with respect to the need to suspend. I'm told that this is not something that's quickly fixed. Just a quick round of thoughts. Should we continue in light of the time that we've lost with respect to the vote, or is there a strong feeling that we would want our staff to be accessible to us in real time?
Point of order, Mr. Chair. I would just say it's been suggested in the past that we just allow our staff to sign onto the Zoom call. It's not an issue for me because I'm in the room. I don't think we should suspend, but can we not simply give staff the opportunity to, at least on a temporary basis, to sign into the Zoom call itself?
We will. Thank you, Mr. Tenos. We'll put that question to our IT team and clerk.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm sorry. It's not common practice right now, and we are working on solutions to make staff joining the meetings more secure.
Yeah, I'll just mention that, we did have major issues with our first meeting, so we should have these things straightened out. We really should. But I'm okay without staff today, but I hope it's fixed for our next meeting.
Anybody else want to weigh in on this quickly? So, Dr. Fry?
I just wanted to say that I think it seems to me to be strange that staff can get in-camera meetings, but they can't get in on public meetings. I mean, surely the security for in-camera meetings should be more stringent than the ones for public meetings. But I think it's important because I understand that there is negotiations going on, and perhaps all of us could go back to our respective whips and see that we can do something to rectify this so that staff can come on public as well as in camera properly. And so we could do this if we wish to.
Yes, Mr. Oliphant.
I would just agree. I hope we can just continue. If the delay was horrendous, I think that'd be a problem. But on this particular meeting, I think we should continue and try to plot our way through it. And I'm always wary about giving an opinion on anything technical because I'm not sure of the facts. So I would say we know the House is working in good faith on this. So we give them a little bit of benefit of the doubt, and we try to just keep plodding on today, and hopefully it gets rectified in the future.
Okay, thank you very much, colleagues. We seem to have a consensus. With that, we will continue maintenant. J'aimerais passer la parole.
I would like to give the floor to Mr. Bergeron. Mr. Bergeron, you have 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our witnesses who are here with us again this week. I hope that we will be able to study things in more depth than last time. One of the things that is quite a mystery is the reasons that Russia has to act here. We do know that Mr. Lukashenko and Mr. Putin do not get along well. And from the very beginning of the demonstrations, we saw that Russia was hesitating between supporting Lukashenko's party or opposing him. Lukashenko went to Moscow, and there was a discussion between the two of them, and at the end, Russia, it seems, decided to side with Belarus. In your opinion, why did Russia decide to make that strategic choice to support Lukashenko instead of taking part in a process like most countries want to go down the road with, the countries of the OSCE?
Chairman, I believe that Russia is very anxious for, most of all, for security on its border. It has long-standing cultural, economic, and historical ties with Belarus, and is anxious to keep it within its sphere of interest. The role that Russia plays in this situation, we take a lot of guidance from civil society and opposition leaders who, as Ms. Tyanuskaya indicated, that as far as Russia is concerned, it is her firm hope that Russia will play a positive role in promoting dialogue. She even offered that Russia may wish to help in offering assistance. And we, Canada, is very keen that Russia play a role. We disagree with Russia in terms of the continuation of Lukashenko in power. He has lost his legitimacy. The holding of the elections and the repression after the elections have excluded him from any right to continue in power. And we would take strongly a different view of Russia insofar as his continuation in power along with those in his regime.
Thank you very much, Chair. I think Ms. Tsikhanouskaya is correct in thinking that any solution to this conflict cannot occur without the participation and agreement of Russia. This being said, if Russia does have security concerns, worries about its borders, and because of the links historically with Belarus, why would Russia choose to support Lukashenko rather than support Ms. Tsikhanouskaya, who has amply demonstrated that she's quite willing to cooperate, collaborate with Russia? Russia went as far as to put out an arrest warrant for Ms. Tsikhanouskaya. So how can we understand this behavior, Russia's behavior? Why couldn't it join the rest of the European community and seek Lukashenko's resignation and allow Ms. Tsikhanouskaya to come to power?
It is interesting, indeed. Ms. Tyanuskaya has indicated that the current problems are not a European Russia problem. They're a domestic problem that has to be resolved domestically amongst the Belarusian people. In terms of Russians' motives, it's always difficult to ascertain. what is motivating Mr. Putin and the Russian government. But I think overall they would like to judge how best they can maintain the influence they do, and we as a country would like to see Russia exert their efforts in a positive way to bring about a resolution that is satisfactory to the Belarusian people, not to Mr. Lukashenko.
Cet effet, quel genre de contact avez-vous avec la Russie?
And what contacts or relations are there? What answers are you getting from Russia as to the pressure that is being exerted on them so that they act more positively vis-a-vis the installation of Ms. Tsikhanouskaya in Minsk rather than maintain the rule of Lukashenko?
To date, we have coordinated closely with our like-minded partners insofar as this crisis is concerned, and we will have to consider how to engage with Russia, and we will look at that depending on the circumstances as they evolve, and take a decision about the best way forward. Keeping in mind, over and above all, we're here to support the aspirations of the Belarusian people, and certainly not the aspirations of Russia vis-a-vis their relations and their ongoing influence in Belarus.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Sproul. Our final round in this, final set of questions in this first round goes to Mr. Harris, again for 6 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. And Mr. Sproul, this is a most intriguing situation. Did the Canadian government decide that the elections in Belarus were fraudulent prior to the elections or after election day? Was there something that happened on the day that caused the decision to be made, or was it the activities prior to that, or was it the outcome of the vote that gave rise to the notion that it must have been fraudulent? No explanation has really been given about that.
Chairman, there were strong indications, and those raised grave concerns for Canada and our like-minded partners about whether or not those elections could be free and fair. Indeed, we didn't have observers from the OSCE who were able to be part of that, which would give some reassurance. And then the reports that we did receive in terms of the behavior of the government officials and their permission to allow people to vote freely and fairly without any sense of pressure, and the outcome, which was completely out of sync with everyone's estimations of the support that was enjoyed by opposition party leaders. And then, of course, the immediate repression and the clampdown on media reporting there too. All those together could make there to be no other conclusion than this was a fraudulent election process.
Obviously, the repression afterwards is clearly indicative of a repressive state, and there's no question that was outrageous and not to be condemned. But it just seems curious that prior to that, there wasn't any public condemnation of the behavior of the Belarusian officials. Tell me, what did Canada make of the fact that in July that there were 33 Russian mercenaries arrested by the Belarusian government authorities, accusing Russia, presumably, of trying to destabilize the election? What did you make of that? What do you make of that?
Mr. Lukashenko must have felt in a very difficult position after being so critical, and this disruption between Russia and his government, insofar as that allegation was concerned, when upon the election being held, he had to reach out to Mr. Putin for support to maintain his power.
The attitude towards Russia seems to be odd, given the fact that in 1999 there was an agreement between Russia and Belarus to undertake the state union, which is recognized as a soft annexation of Belarus by Russia, including, ultimately, if followed through, it would amount to the same common currency, parliament, defense, and foreign policies, according to the briefing note we received. That seems to me to be, part of Russia's plan. What confidence does anyone have that Russia has either changed that plan or no longer wishes to have the kind of influence that would imply over Belarus, regardless of who's in power?
Well, it is the case that since 1999, Mr. Lukashenko has exerted an effort to distance himself from that kind of control where he finds it possible. As far as Russia's motives are concerned about Belarus, it's very difficult for us to judge, except that his actions since the election have indicated that he's quite determined to maintain a very close relationship with who is in power in Belarus.
So that would be equally either him or I can't pronounce her name, Tikhanovskaya. Would he equally be interested in a close relationship with her if she were the leader?
Well, it's doubtful, given his support for Lukashenko and her opposition to Mr. Lukashenko. So far, he has sided with the Lukashenko regime.
So why would Mr. Putin or Russia in general be able to help in ensuring that the civil society in Belarus is going to have some sort of control over the future?
Well, it is quite possible that the opposition and civil society will seem to be overcoming their opposition for Lukashenko and the repression. And they may be the side that prevails. Canada, for its part, would like to see everything get back to its democratic, set right democratically, free and fair elections be held. And if that trend starts to continue, it may well be that Russia has to reconsider the position it's taken in continuing to support Mr. Lukashenko.
Sounds like wishful thinking to me. One last question concerning the state of play. The sanctions that have been imposed, are they actually effective, or are they symbolic? Or do these individuals actually have any economic relationship with Canada or any stakes in the results of those sanctions?
Well, we expect that some do, but what is really important that these sanctions be imposed in solidarity with like-minded countries, because after all, if you look at the countries which have imposed sanctions, the UK, the United States, EU, and its member countries, that suggests, of course, that is a large area with countries which people like to travel to, people like to invest to, people like to do business with, and it will have a personal impact on those people.
Thank you very much, Mr. Harris. Mr. Sproul, we'll now go out to our second round of questions. And just a reminder to colleagues and to witnesses, we have a couple of 2.5-minute slots in that round, just to be mindful of the time. Our first round of questions is for 5 minutes and goes to Mr. Genuis. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Sproul, my colleague, Mr. Chong, had asked you about the use of the Special Economic Measures Act as opposed to the Magnitsky Act. And you had said, well, the criteria were clearly met for the Special Economic Measures Act. I just want to probe that a little bit. Is the implication that the criteria were not met for the Magnitsky sanctions? Is the criteria different for those different sanction vehicles? And what are the practical consequences of choosing one sanctions vehicle over the other?
Thank you, Chairman. Perhaps for this question, I would defer to my colleague, Ms. Grant, who is more active on these issues and could offer a better answer than I could.
Sure, thank you. Yes, Mr. Chair. In this case, sanctions under CIMA are imposed in relation to the actions of a foreign state, which is appropriate here because it's the actions of a foreign state that we've seen in terms of the human rights violations committed by the Belarusian state against its people, whereas Magnitsky is more individual-based. So in this case, CIMA has been completely appropriate, and the trigger that's provided in CIMA is where we find gross and systematic human rights violations to have occurred and been committed by a foreign state, in this case by the Belarusian administration. So I think that speaks to why we used the CIMA mechanism.
Okay, thank you. If I understand correct then, though, the use of CIMA, because it's not a sanction against individuals, would it still allow individuals who are in senior roles within the Belarusian state to travel, to move their money, to own assets in other countries?
Yes, and Mr. Chair, sorry, I need to correct myself. It is the sanctions enacted under CIMA are in this case targeted against individuals. So we have 42 individuals that where sanctions will be applied under the CIMA for Belarus, and the consequences for those individuals are that they are inadmissible to Canada, that Canadians cannot have dealings with those individuals, and also that their assets, if they have assets in Canada, would be frozen. So those are consequences against a set of individuals, but the CIMA trigger, the reason why the trigger was reached in CIMA is because of the human rights violations that we judge to have been actions of a foreign state, in this context, the state of Belarus and the administration of Belarus. So that is
okay. Yeah, if I understood you right, then the trigger's different. The effects on the individuals are the same. So there would be no need, I suppose, to pose Magnitsky sanctions as well, because the effects are the same on the individuals. Is that right?
That's my assessment. Yes, I'm not. I need to qualify. I'm not a sanctions expert, but that is my assessment. Yes.
Okay. A different question. I found it interesting that the government of China was sort of quick out of the gate to endorse terrible with pronunciation of these names, but the existing president, and this seems to be an interesting case of sort of daylight between the Russian position and the Chinese government position. I wonder if either of you have thoughts about what sort of the strategic agenda of China is. Is it distinct from Russia? What are its goals in Belarus? And what does this suggest about the sort of relationship between Chinese and Russian foreign policy?
Mr. Chairman, they did take slightly different approaches. China, it's not uncommon for them to support regimes, authoritarian regimes, and therefore they have done so to a great extent in this case. I think that Russia needs, their position has to be a little more nuanced. They are on the border with the country, and it was part of their sphere of influence, in fact, part of the Soviet Empire, and their ties are more essential, closer.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up in the time I have left? What does it mean to Russia that China has taken this position in their immediate backyard?
I don't know what it means for Russia. I think overall it indicates that China does see itself as a world power, and that has interests and will play a part as appropriate everywhere internationally, not just in the region.
Thank you, Mr. Generous. Mr. Sproul, again, perfectly timed. The next round again is 5 minutes and goes to Mr. Fonseca. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Sproul, following up just on Russia, I've read some reports that there's a semi-permanent Russian military presence in Belarus. Are you aware of that?
Again, I'm going to defer this question to Ms. Grant.
Or Ms. Grant.
Thank you. Yes. No, I don't have details on any Russian semi-permanent military presence. I know that a point of contention between Russia and Belarus over the years has been the establishment of a military base in Belarus, and you've seen publicly Alexander Lukashenko make comments about that weren't welcomed by Russia. And we did see before in early September, we did see a gathering of Russian National Guard and law enforcement near the Russian-Belarusian border that was called back after the meeting between President Putin and Lukashenko on September 14th, where those were withdrawn. They weren't in Belarus proper, though. That's the information I have.
So just to follow up on that, so what are the risks that Russia would or could intervene directly in Belarus?
It's hard to, I would say, Mr. Chair, that it's hard to gauge the risks of something like a Russian intervention. We obviously do not want Russia interfering in Belarus's internal affairs. As Mr. Sproul said, Russia is very concerned about stability on its borders. We've seen that before with other states too. So it will be tracking political stability. They, to date, have publicly recognized Belarusian sovereignty and have not made any declarations that imply that they will be intervening. So it is something to monitor and to watch. It's hard again to gauge the risk. I think from the Russian point of view, they look at stability on their borders, and a massive deterioration of stability I think would be a cause. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, we've seen many vulnerable citizens put themselves out there in these protests. We've seen women, we've seen people with disabilities, factory workers, those from academia. So quite a swath of the general public that is out there in these protests, hundreds of thousands of people as they continue to grow. Another group that I want to bring to your attention are athletes, Olympians, world champions, #1 tennis players in the world, etc. that are protesting. I wanted to ask, in terms of our foreign policy, I've been asked by the Belarusian Canadian Alliance and Mr. Mit Korot, would there be an opportunity for Canada to look at providing a refugee status, permanent resident status, so these individuals that are being persecuted would be able to, if they thought of coming to Canada, be able to be sponsored to be able to come over here?
Chairman, this is a question that would have to be determined in each individual case, and whether or not the individual in question meets the criteria for status as a refugee. It's very difficult to speak in very general terms. It is possible to talk about the difficult situation that the Belarusian people find themselves in their country, but about whether or not any individual, be it an athlete or otherwise, meets a criteria would have to be determined.
Mr. Chair, anytime?
You have 1 minute left.
Okay, thank you very much. So just going again on Russia. So to what degree does Belarus depend on Russia? Economically, military-wise, do they have support from anybody else? We heard China, but besides China, who has gotten behind Belarus?
Since the crisis?
Since the crisis.
Well, there have been many countries which have not been supportive and as actively engaged in terms of pushing back against the regime as has Canada and like-minded. In terms of active support, there hasn't been very much. And it's difficult to see why governments would want to back what many think will be ultimately a losing proposition by Mr. Lukashenko as he continues his repression of his own people.
So play this out as these protests continue to grow. Where do you see this conflict ending?
So very brief answer, Mr. Sproul, please.
Well, I think it's indicative that it's not likely to end as Mr. Lukashenko would like, and that repression has not so far succeeded. And there will have to be some sort of compromise on his part. And we would advocate fresh new elections and a new start with a regime that's respectful of human rights.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fonseca, Mr. Sproul. La prochaine série de questions sera posée par Monsieur Bergeron. La parole est à vous pour 2 minutes et demie.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll ask my questions one after the other. First of all, does the Canadian government, or has it coordinated with other countries from the Western world as to the sanctions that are being applied to the leadership and those agents of state of Belarus? It seems that there's some credible proof that some of these specific protests have been subjected to torture. Last week, apparently, we didn't have any proof of mercenaries, Syrians, or Karabakh. This week, do we have? Does the Canadian government have any evidence of torture being used in Belarus?
The first one, with regard to coordination of sanctions, yes, we have coordinated very closely with sanctions. You will know that the first set of sanctions that Canada imposed, we did so in coordination and on the same day as the United Kingdom, and soon thereafter the EU followed. The second set of sanctions were coordinated very closely with others, and they were very close or even on the same day as the European Union imposed theirs. So it's fair to say that we do coordinate very closely because that is how they're most effective when we impose those. We do have quite credible reports of repression, abuse of detainees, sexual violence against those who are incarcerated. The human rights abuses from quite credible sources are quite alarming, and that has led to many of the measures that Canada has taken, indeed under CIMA, with regard to individuals because of these systematic and gross violations.
Monsieur Bergeron, il vous reste 30 secondes pour une petite question et réponse.
You have 30 seconds left, Mr. Bergeron, for a quick question. Well, I think it would be unjust to ask our witness to reply within 30 seconds, so I'll just thank him very much for his contribution so far.
And our next round is 2.5 minutes. It goes to Mr. Harris.
I didn't hear you, but I think you're referring to me, Chair. Your voice wasn't coming through. Thank you, though. So, Mr. Sproul, can you, we've reported Canada has given $600,000 in funding to support civil society in Belarus. Could you tell me how usual or how unusual such a move is? And are there further plans to assist civil society, shall we say, in Belarus in order to alleviate the situation and provide for better communications?
Ms. Grant has been actively involved in our efforts in this regard, so I will ask her if she could respond.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Chair, we are quite actively involved, especially right at this moment, in determining our programming in support of Belarusian civil society. We did announce the $600,000 in funding to civil society with a focus on independent media and women's leadership. And we are right at the stage of developing projects to correspond to that number. We're also working very quickly to assess additional programming opportunities as well in the civil society and democracy sphere, looking at governance and other such issues. And I think that it is an appropriate and usual response in this sort of situation where we are first and foremost trying to support the democratic aspirations of the Belarusian people.
Thank you. Further on the activities of particularly the human rights violations and the allegations of torture, is there UN involved in any way, and particularly the human rights observers? Is there any approach to them to get involved in this and further identify the potential for response to that? Mr. Sproul, perhaps you're more involved in that, I think.
Well, yes, there already has been a debate on the situation as far as UN concerned. There has been statements, I believe, by the Secretary General about the situation. And You will also know that there has recently been consideration of Belarus's human rights record under the UCP and the Human Rights Committee, which Canada was an active participant. So the United Nations has been quite active on this issue, and we fully expect that if the situation continues as it is, it will continue to be very active.
And what kind of action can we anticipate?
Well,
just a very brief response, please, Mr. Sproul.
It will be handicapped by the fact that any Security Council action will be undermined somewhat by the role that Russia may play in terms of its efforts to block that sort of action. But there is a whole host of mechanism and instruments the United Nations can do outside of Security Council resolutions.
Thank you so much. The next round is a 5-minute round, and it goes to Mr. Morantz. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Sproul, I want to talk to you about the press release from May of 2016 to lift sanctions on Belarus. At the time that the area control, the ACL, the area control permit was area control list. They were taken off the area control list. My apologies. Was this at the request? You've gone through the reasons for that, but was this at the request of the Belarusian government?
I am sure that the Belarusian government would have wanted the lifting of that.
Yeah.
And it is the case that we engage with the Belarusian government and discuss the issues about why this is.
Sure.
It is the case that we explain to them the importance of doing certain measures to remove themselves from such a list.
Yes, and so after they were removed from the list, the press release talks about the resumption of normally issued export permits of goods and technology. Were any goods and technology exported to Belarus between the time of the lifting of the country from the ACL and now?
If you're referring to Group 2 items from the export control list, our review, and I will have to get back to you about how far back we went, we do not see any permits that have been applied for or given.
Okay, so it just seems interesting to me that they would want to be taken off that list to be eligible for such exports and not having received any. So if you could check and let us know what, if there were any, and what, I'd be curious to know what was exported after they were taken off the list.
Are you interested in what was exported from Canada generally, or insofar as arms-related exports?
Arms-related exports as a result of them being Belarus being taken off the area control list.
Well, right now I am aware that there are not any pending export permits, nor have any been issued to Belarus from that list.
But since 2016?
We will go back further and double check for you to be sure.
Okay, it would be good information to have. The so you'll return that to the clerk of the committee?
Yes.
Great. Going forward, so sorry, the press release says that going forward, Canada will continue to monitor the evolving situation in Belarus and will engage with the government of Belarus in order to advance human rights, democratic standards and norms, and respect for the rights of a civil society. Just out of curiosity, given it was in the release, what specific engagement did the government of Canada do with Belarus to further those specific goals?
Okay, Chairman, if I might go back, pursuant to, you remember our discussion at the last hearing, the information we're able to give you going back to 2016, if there were any, it would not be specific for privacy reasons, but it would be a general statistic, which I think you probably are interested in. Insofar as engagement is concerned, with it, we re-engaged and had discussions. Our department had discussions with their department as far as that's concerned. Those had not been undertaken for some time before that. There was more active work with civil society, while and there was increased engagement as far as our embassy in Warsaw is concerned, which has responsibility for.
Okay, and just out of curiosity, with respect to the CIMA, the sanctions, why were they not put back on the area control list as part of the sanctions? You used sanctions under CIMA, but why not put them back on the area control list given what's happened?
In the circumstances, Canada, one of the overriding considerations was we needed to act quickly and send a very strong message. CIMA was a very, very excellent way to do it because, as I said, they met the criteria particularly and were able to put that together quite quickly.
Is there being consideration?
Well, as far as the area control list, it always is a fine line to find out, to put that in because of the broad nature of those, to make sure that what sanctions you do are aimed particularly at the violators and do not hurt or harm the general population. So those have to be done with some care and timing and walk that fine line.
Is it being examined though?
We consider all our options and all the tools we have in our kit.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Muntz. Thank you, Mr. Sproul. Our final series of questions goes to Ms. de Bruzen for 5 minutes, please. Go ahead. The floor is yours.
Well, and thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to pick up actually a bit from, I believe, Mr. Harris's question. He was talking about the UN, and one of his questions wasn't just about the actions at the UN, but about UN observers. Have there been UN observers in Belarus?
I am not sure whether there have been UN observers. I know in the past there have been OSCE observers, but maybe I could defer to Ms. Grant again in case she has better information.
There is a UN special rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Belarus that monitors the UN, the human rights situation from a UN perspective. But no, I'm not aware of UN observers on the ground, human rights observers on the ground.
And maybe I misheard because I thought that there had been reference earlier when Mr. Sproul was talking to an OSCE rapporteur that had prepared a report but could not travel to Belarus. Is that correct? Okay,
That's right.
I saw you nod.
Yes.
So, why were they unable to travel to Belarus?
The Belarus government did not allow them entry into the country.
Okay. And just on that same thing, because you had mentioned, I believe, that the OSCE didn't have observers in Belarus for the election. Why was that?
They were not permitted entry into the country to observe the elections, is my understanding.
I could add.
Oh, sure, please do.
I could add just one clarification. They did not. The reason was that they did not issue an invitation to the OSCE in a timely fashion. So by the deadline that the OSCE's ODIHR arm needed to organize a proper electoral mission. There came, at the last minute, there was a move from Belarus, but it was far too late for the OSCE to be able to mount a credible mission.
Right. But so far, I'm not hearing about many people on the ground being able to help monitor. What are the international resources on the ground able to monitor what's happening right now in Belarus?
We're relying on civil society contacts, like-minded countries with diplomatic missions there, contacts who are in the media, civil society, think tanks, universities. Those are the people we have information that is being received from.
Okay, but that goes, I guess, to a bit of the heart of why I'm asking these questions is because throughout the time that you've been talking and what we've been hearing about human rights violations, we've been hearing about political prisoners, and particularly when I looked at the travel advisory to go to Belarus, it refers specifically to targets being journalists. So asking that question, how are we ensuring that these people who are providing us with this monitoring advice, members of civil society, these journalists, these professors, what are we doing to ensure their security?
Well, first and foremost, we're ensuring the confidentiality of the information we receive. And we do not want to inadvertently expose them to risks to their person or their families. So we're very, very careful.
Sorry, I didn't catch that last bit just because your sound is a little low here.
So our interaction with people who advise us on the situation as it is, if they are under risk for assisting and giving us information, we have to be very careful with its use and its dissemination, particularly its source.
I have very little time, so I just want to ask about asylum claims. What are we doing to support asylum seekers? Are they making it to Canada? Are we not asking you as to whether they qualify for refugee status or not, but what I'm asking is for asylum seekers from Belarus, what are we doing to ensure that they can make it to safety, and are they getting to Canada?
Ms. Grant, are you aware of, has there been an outflow of people seeking refuge?
No, that's not something I am not aware of, an outflow. We've had good discussions with the Belarusian Canadian Alliance and the diaspora here in Canada, fruitful conversations. I've been in touch and a bit dated conversations. So this wasn't a topic then. However, it is something that does need to be reviewed. I note that in the OSCE's report out today, there was a reference to asylum. So it's certainly something that Canada with like-minded partners will be looking at. Of course, it is a lead for IRCC department, but we'll be in touch and looking at this.
Thank you so much, Ms. Grant, Madame de Brussen. Thank you for these questions. That completes our full second round of questions. I propose that, given the fact that we have some committee business ahead of us, that we thank our witnesses for being with us today, for their service, their expertise, and their testimony, and that we reconvene shortly in camera to go through the rest of today's work plan. Mr. Spruill, Ms. Grant, thank you so much for being with us and for your testimony this afternoon.
You're welcome.
And we will be suspended for a few minutes until we're back in camera. Thank you, Madam Clerk.
Bye.